Hello everyone, my name is Brian Gorman and I am an instructor at Udemy and I am teaching a course called the ASP.NET MVC Quick Start. So this course is designed to help you go through the basic working pieces of the ASP.NET MVC architecture and put together a public-facing application that has CRUD operations and essentially manages contacts for you. So it's a really awesome project because it's quite simple to set up, and I'm going to try to take you through most of it today, even in this video. And I want to talk a moment first before I dive in about why this specific application. So what you see on the screen right now is an actual job post from dice.com that I found a few years ago when I was looking at potential jobs and just kind of searching through the market. And I saw this post and I thought, now that's an incredibly awesome idea. They're looking for an awesome software developer, and they say, if you want to apply for this job, you need to be able to prove that you can do what you say you can do. So quickly set up a public-facing application that contains information about contacts, including the first and last name, their city and zip. Now they also say vaguely that they're leaving some of the details specifically blank, which gives you the opportunity to enhance the application in a way that you could see fit to make yourself stand out. But also, this gives us a chance to actually build something tangible. And I thought, why not do this as a course so that those of you who are watching this and just learning about ASP.NET MVC for the first time, as well as anybody who might find themselves in a situation where they need to put something into their public profile so that they could say on their job applications, look at what I've built. I'm not just a random applicant for this job. I'm actually someone who can put my money where my mouth is. And so that's what this course is for. Now, before we dive into the details about the course, I want to make a little bit of a caveat. With the fact that we're essentially doing a whirlwind tour of the ASP.NET MVC architecture, we're going to spend some time just barely briefly touching on the different moving parts. So we'll look at models and views and controllers, but we won't go into a lot of detail about what the actual architecture means as far as the technical terminology. We're going to be doing a practical application with an end result of you, the student, getting a public-facing website that allows you to authenticate a user and store contact information. We'll be looking at some other tools that we can use to enhance the application, such as the datatables.js library, which gives us a really nice grid that we can search and sort on with very little effort on our part. So we'll see a little bit of adding some JavaScript to the views. We'll see a little bit of the entity framework behind the scenes when we build our models and put that into the context and do some migrations. And so we're going to get a really good overview of the .NET MVC framework, as well as working with C# and then MVC.NET to produce a public-facing website. Now, I'm not a really big fan of being a face on camera when I'm trying to do technical teaching. So what I'd like to do now is just take a moment. I'm going to stop this video as I'm recording it so we can get my face off of here. And then we'll pick up and I'm going to just walk you through, hopefully in the next hour here, pretty much all you would need to do to get set up with the MVC.NET application public facing that you could then put on your LinkedIn profile as a project you've worked on, or submit with all of your web application developer jobs that you're looking for and say, here's a sample of my work, which is way better than some reference because now you can say, I can actually see your work. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so before we begin, what I'd like to do is just take a moment to go over the tools that I'll be using. And I'm not going to do any of the downloads and installs for this today. If you are struggling with any of that, all of that is available on my course for free in the preview videos, so you could go watch those videos for free if you needed to. But essentially, we need a set of tools in order to accomplish this task, and they're all free, so we can get them very easily. The first one is Visual Studio Community 2017, and each of these is easily reachable through Google search. So just search for Visual Studio Community 2017 and you'll find plenty of information. We're also going to be using SQL Server Express Edition 2017. Now note that these are all tools from 2017, but you could use the latest version. It doesn't really matter what year they are, just get the latest version and use it. we're going to be using SQL Server Management Studio, and that's going to be a tool that we use to be able to connect to our database. And also, as an optional tool in the videos on the course, we use this Git for Windows. And it's a nice tool to have because you can install it to your shell and allow Git bash to work on your Windows machine. And then we'll be doing a repository at Bitbucket. We'll be posting to AppHarbor, which is a really nice web platform that we can use and create applications for free online. And that's where our public URL is going to live. And ultimately, that's where we're going to land. So you see here my application, contactweb.appharb.com or apphb.com. This is what we're going for. We're going to end up with a web solution online that has the ability to have an about, a contact us, and ultimately a my contacts page that requires being logged in. So the really cool thing is that I built this a little while ago. So right now I can still, even though I'm on a not secure connection, I can still use Facebook. And in the videos on the course, we do talk about Facebook authentication. The thing is, in order to do Facebook authentication today, and going forward, assumingly, they've changed their structure a little bit, and you must have an HTTPS or secure connection to the web. To do that, I do not know of a single way that you can do that for free. However, you may have options through a company that you work for having like a wildcard certificate, or perhaps you have your own. But for $20 a month, $10 for the domain and $10 for the security certificate, you can also do it at AppHarbor. There are also available solutions at Azure or Amazon, so you don't have to use AppHarbor if you don't like AppHarbor either. So what I'm going to do is log in with my Facebook account here so that we can see the contacts page that we're trying to build. And you can see that it allows me to log in, and I can go to my contacts. And you can see all of my contacts are available. I have first name, last name, email, phones, birthdays, street addresses, city, state, and zip. I have the ability to edit, list, or delete them. I can create a new contact at any time and basically just go through and put in some bunk information. I'm not doing any validation on this, so you can see that that would be something we would want to add in the future. And that gives us the ability to create a contact as we go and save it, and then we can edit that contact. So we can change something about them. And maybe his name is actually Adam's son. Save that. And so we end up with the ability to edit that. We can do a listing of that information, and we can also delete our contact. So that's the web system we're going to build. And the tools, again, that we're going to use are Visual Studio, SQL Server Express, and the SQL Server Management Studio. We're going to be using Git for our repository. We'll create our repository at Bitbucket, which is a free place to create a repository that's private through the Atlassian tool suite. You could also use GitHub if you prefer, or some other Git solution. But the nice thing about GitHub or Bitbucket is that it wires up nicely with automatic integrations to AppHarbor. And so we can get that set up, as well as a database there at AppHarbor and our public-facing web system that we're going to build today. So that wraps up our section on tools, and we're going to move forward now into actually using Visual Studio. All right, so here we are in Visual Studio, and what we need to do is create our web application. So we're going to go File, New, Project, and then we'll create a new web project, an ASP.NET web application. So just a brief moment, if you're using a Mac or Linux and you're trying to work with Visual Studio, you will need to do a core web application, which is pretty much the same as what we're doing here today. The major differences in a core and a regular MVC web application for what we're doing will be how you integrate with your entity framework. It's different for core. Some of the commands are just a little different than they are in the MVC framework. So you would need to do just a couple simple commands a little differently than what we're doing here. Other than that, pretty much everything would be the same. The libraries that we're using are all available in Core as well as the MVC Web at this point. And again, the main reason for using Core would be if you want to be cross-platform. If you don't need to be cross-platform, Core is not necessary. Now, I believe going forward, what you'll find is that Microsoft will be moving everything to Core. And at some point, that will be the only framework. So just keep that in mind as well. Now, that's just me speculating. So we're going to save our project wherever we want. So we have, I've pre-created on my drive here a folder for my projects. And in my projects, I want to do a live MVC demo. I'm going to select that folder, and I'm just going to call it Contact Web Live Demo. And it's going to be in 4.6.1 because I have not downloaded the latest version of the .NET Framework, which is 4.7 at this point, or 4.7.2 even. But basically, whatever framework's available at the time you're doing this should be just fine. I'm going to create the directory for the solution. I am not going to create the Git repository. I'm going to do that manually through a command in just a little bit. So we'll get that up. Go ahead and start the project. It's going to be an MVC project. We're not doing Web API or a single page application. Web API, of course, is if you want to make a REST service. This is a really great tool. You can also add Web API to your MVC if you'd like REST endpoints available for whatever reason. Single page application, of course, if you want to do something like an Angular singular page app, then that's where you'd want to go. We're not doing mobile or web forms or anything else like that today. We want to leave it MVC checked. We're not going to do Docker. We're not doing unit tests. And we want to change our authentication because we have no authentication at this time. And we want individual user accounts so that we can keep the user separate and they can have their own list of contacts. We're going to go OK on that. And it'll take just a moment for Visual Studio to generate the project. So while it's doing that, you note that it says it's creating the project. It's going to bring in all of the NuGet libraries that it needs in order to work. And that will take just a moment. And you see now it's created the project. And we have on the right-hand side, I have my Solution Explorer open. And I have this home welcome page. So we're going to go ahead and close that. Just going to make this a little bigger. You can see in our solution, out of the box, we have an app data folder, an app start folder. And this is where you're going to have all your config information for things like your JavaScripts and your CSS imports. All that's going to happen through the bundle config. And so we're not going to go into detail on that today, but that's where you'd want to look if you want to do some changes. And then ultimately we have the content for where our Bootstrap stuff is going to go. Again, I'm just going to leave the default structure in place today. For MVC, we have models, views, and controllers. And we're not going to go into the deep roots of what the MVC architectural framework means and how all the technical terminology of that works. But what we will see is the practical application of those MVC components. So the C is controllers. The controller is essentially the channel of communication between the model and the view. And so the model will hit the database and structure our data, and the view will render it to the user. And the controller is the communication between them. So the C of controllers, we have an account controller for your user registration, the home page, landing page, and we have a managed controller that we won't even use. It'll just be there. We have fonts, and then we have our models folder. You can see each model that's already in use is there. Some scripts, you could see where some JavaScript is loaded. And basically that's loaded through that bundle config, but that's the landing place for the actual files. And then we have our views. And our views, of course, give us the ability at this point to have a home with an about, contact, and index, an account that has essentially all of our account information for registering users and things like that. And then a shared, which is where we have our layout for the general overall look of the entire application. So just so you're aware of where that is, there's your navigation. And so we haven't done anything at this point, and we have already a complete web solution. So if I go ahead and just hit F5 to run this, we're going to see that it will load up and we'll already have the ability to do a lot of things with our web application. And you can see it pops up. We have our home page, we have our about page, our contact page, the application name. We have a register and a login, which I'm not going to do yet because we haven't set the specific database we want to use. And so that's what I want to do next. We'll go ahead and stop the web here. And we will go to our Web.config and set our connection information. Right, so we are going to change our connection string for the default connection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this out and make it a little larger. But also I want to get a little bit of stuff that I've pre-configured here so that I can save just a little bit of time. So essentially what I'm doing is setting my connection string to not use a local file. Now you could use a local file, that's fine for your development environment. But just to be completely stable and get the entire feel of working with actual databases that are outside of our control of the application, not just a file, I'm going to go ahead and use a local database file. And this is why we need SQL Express. So my SQL Express instance is named with all caps. It's very important you check yours and make sure that it lines up. You can see that in your services, and it basically will show the name here. So if you named it something else during installation or don't have all caps, it's just important to remember that so you can make sure you can connect to it. We're just going to leave the connection name as the default connection, and the database we're going to create is going to be called Contact Web Live DB, and it's going to just use our trusted connection for this connection string, and we'll leave multiple active result sets equal to true so that we can do some things with Entity Framework and not run into some concurrency issues with connections and open readers and things. And then we have the provider name, which is the SQL client, and so that was already there, but essentially that sets up our connection string. So with that, I want to stop with Visual Studio for a moment and go into SQL Server Management Studio Express, because here I'm going to create my database. So I already have this open and connected to it. If you didn't, you just hit connect, bring up your database engine, and then whatever it needs to connect. This is either a dot, local, or the name of your machine should work. Any of those, just try whatever you need in order to get connected, and hopefully that will get you connected. You should be fine. We'll create the new database, and again, I already named mine in my string, in my connection string, so I'm just going to use that same name here. I'm going to leave everything as default, and I'm going to say OK. And that creates my Contact Web Live DB, and you see that there are absolutely no tables in this at this time. So what I'm going to do next is run the application and actually register a user. And so I need to get back to my Visual Studio. And in here, what I'm going to do is just hit F5 to run it. And now that it's up, I'm going to go ahead and register an account. So I'm just going to use my local email and a password that makes sense with at least one number, one special character, one capital, and one small letter. Go ahead and hit register. And if we have our database wired up correctly, we should be able to do this just fine. And so now what I can do is check my database here, refresh my tables. And you can see that it created a migration table and then all of my user and roles information that I need, which right now is simply just going to contain my user information. And so we have my user in place and ready to go. And you can see that I'm logged in under that user. So we do have our database configured correctly, and we are connected to the database, and we've created an account. So next what we want to do is actually start building the model, the M in the MVC, to get our contact information put in place. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Visual Studio here, and we're going to kill the running. We can go ahead and close our Web.config for now. And we're going to go to the Models section. So here what we're going to do is add a new model by right-clicking, selecting Add, Class, and our class name is going to be contact.cs. And this is essentially going to be the model that structures our table for the database. So to model our contact, we need the information that was at least required, and we'll do that through public properties. Do an int for ID. And then we'll do a GUID for the user ID. This is going to map directly to the user ID in the user table. So that way each contact can have its own user. And we need first name and last name. I want to show you a shortcut, prop, and hit tab. It gives you that public setup already. So our int is going to actually be string. And my property is going to be first name. And then I need to do the same thing for last name. And I'm just hitting tab a couple times to get off of that to the next one. You can see you can move between them. And I need email, phone primary, phone secondary, a date time for birthday, and then street address 1, 2, city, state, and zip. So I'm going to type those really quickly off camera, and I'll be right back. And so there you see our contact information in place. We have the ID, the user ID to map to, first name, last name, email, phone, and birthday, and street address, city, state, and zip. So we have all the information about this contact that we would want to store. Now we are doing this in a flat contact, and you could consider learning a little bit more outside of this as far as maybe separating out addresses or things like that. But to keep things very simple and very straightforward today, we're going to just do a flat single contact that maps to that user ID. So now that we have our contact in place, we need to set up our database so that it can store these contacts and work with them. And so to do that, we need to do a couple things. The first thing we want to do is we want to go get our package manager open. So under tools, we get our package manager console. And I just want to note that I'm going to purposefully do something wrong here just to show what would happen if you did it this way. So I'm going to say add migration, created contact entity. So when I do this, we're going to have a problem because I've not set up migrations yet on my machine. So it's going to give me an error, and I'm expecting that. But I wanted to show that we think that we're ready to go because we have the contact in place, and we now get that error. The error is that we don't have the contact live demo set up for migrations. So there's no migrations configuration type. All we need to get that is type enable migrations. And again, if you're using core, this is where it might diverge just a little bit in how you're going to do a few things in these commands. Essentially, you need to enable migrations so that your system does that. And then it says, oh, I already have the database. I have some stuff in place. So I have an initial create that it built for me. I didn't do anything. And in there it says, oh, this is where the roles and the tables and the users and all that stuff was built. So now we have to wonder, well, did we break something? Because we have a problem that we've already created something, but did we apply the migration? And luckily for us, the system is smart enough. We shouldn't have to worry about that. The migration was created automatically for these users and roles the first time we did stuff. So we don't have to worry about it. Now we think, okay, now I can add my migration for contact because everything's in place. And actually, before we do that, let's update the database just to make sure that the roles and users and such were actually applied through a migration. And if they were, this will just say up to date. So we're good to go. No pending explicit migrations, running seed method. So we're good. So in the course, we do go over a little bit about seeding contacts. We're not going to do seeding today. So if you want to see more on that, you can see that in the course itself. So what we're going to do next now is say, okay, I'm going to add the contact. So I have my contact entity ready to go. My entity code first migrations are in place. I should be able to do this, right? And what do you think? There's nothing. Well, what just happened? Why is my contact not being picked up? The reason is because I need to add it to the actual context so it knows to pick it up. So I'm going to actually just delete this migration because I have not applied it. Now again, if you're in core, you would just do a remove migration at this point. So we go ahead and delete that. I'm just going to make sure everything's saved, so I'm good to go. And then what I want to do is look for my DB context. So I'm going to hit Control-T, and I'm going to type DB context. And you see application DB context is pulled up, so I'm going to go to that file, which also is what's going to be mapped to in our configuration. In the course, we actually use two separate DB contexts, which presents a few problems and helps us work through a few things. We're going to do just one today. We're going to do everything through this same application DB context. And that's just fine. It just means that our users and our contact information all has to be on the same database. So to get my contacts into the system, what I need is a property. This is going to be a DB set of contact. And it's just a property that we'll call contacts so that we can get to them. And we'll get and set that, and we'll save that. And that's going to put into the contact web, or the application DB configuration here, context, a list of contacts, essentially, that we can get to directly at the DB and do things against, like insert or work with. So now that I have that, let's go ahead and add our migration. And now what we can see in our migration that was just completed, we have our contacts table. It has the contacts creation with all the properties that we had. And note that we didn't do anything very particular here as far as locking down what the field values need to be and mapping to tables for relationships. For example, the only thing that's required at this point is an ID. The user ID can be null, which is actually really bad, and we would want to fix that in the future. And we want to actually map that to be the user ID in the ASP.NET users table. And then also we should do things like make things required that we want, first name, last name, email, etc. And maybe put string links on them so that they don't take up maximum string length in the database. And also go through things like the birthday, making it a date time, etc. We're going to leave it like this just for simplicity's sake today to keep things moving forward very quickly. And what I want to do is go ahead and just run my migration by doing update database. And once I do that, and that completes, we should have a contacts table. So you see it ran it. Again, it runs the seed after you migrate. We don't have anything in the seed at this point. So let's refresh our database. And now in our tables, we see contacts. And in the contacts table, again, we see our very straightforward contact information with an ID, user ID that can be null, and all of that information. And that's going to bring us to the end of actually working through the migrations to get the contacts set up. And next, what we're going to do is actually scaffold out the controller and view actions for contacts. So we want to go back into Visual Studio, and we are going to scaffold out a controller for our contact information. To do that, all we're going to do is on the controllers, we're going to right-click and select Add Controller, and that's going to bring up the wizard. We're going to be doing an MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. Now that's going to allow us to set the model and scaffold all of the views for the essential application CRUD that we need on this controller, and it'll be really awesome because it'll do all that for us. So we set our model class to be our contact. Our data context is the application DB context. We're not using async controller actions today. We're going to generate views, reference the script libraries, use the default layout page, leaving it blank, and the controller name is the most important part. I click on it and it highlights just contacts, because that's how we're going to navigate to it. So the word controller is for convention, and that tells the system this is a controller. So if I navigate to my web page /contacts, it's going to go to the contacts controller and run the index method without me doing anything else. So let's go ahead and add this, and we can take a look at what it actually builds for us. The really nice thing is it does all of this out of the box. We don't have to do any work at all. Once we set everything up correctly and hit go, it says, all right, here's your contacts controller. Let's take a look at it. So again, this is the C in the MVC. The M is the model, the C is the controller, and here we are with a controller that has a reference directly to our application DB context. In a more advanced solution, you would want to eventually put this into some dependency injection so you don't new it up every time you do a new controller. But notice that we have an index method that has return view with the db.contacts.toList. So what's cool about that is that gives us the ability to get all the contacts, put them into a list, and return them directly to the view on load of index. So our very first hit of that page shows our contacts on the page as we expect. We can get a specific one by ID. Note contact/details with the ID, and that could be any number of a valid contact in our database. It also checks and makes sure that we have ID that's actually good and that the contact's actually good, and if so, then it just returns a single contact to the view called details. Create is going to let us see the create page, and then we post on save to actually create, binding the information. All that is set up for us, and a contact is the model that we're mapping to, and ultimately then we can save it directly to the contacts. So if you decide at some point you want to start using view models, what you would do is map to the view model in your action, and then you would need to create it back to a full contact to save it. So just a little bit of advanced information there. For editing, you're going to, again, pass in the ID to edit, and if it's not good, you can't otherwise return that view with the edit information populated for us, and then we'll have the ability to post back editing, again, binding to that contact that we're editing and saving it. Deleting just takes the ID, makes sure it's good. When we post and we have it confirmed that we want it to, it says yes, we're going to go ahead and do that, and that's essentially the controller. Now what you notice is that each one of these methods is specifically named: index, details, create, edit, and delete. So those need to map exactly to views or they don't work. And so what it did for us was it actually wired up all our views as well. So if we go down under our views, again, this is the V in MVC. So we have we have controllers, we have models, and now we have views. And all of these working together, the controller communicates between the model, which hits the database, and the view, which renders to the UI. We have our create, which maps directly, and note that it takes in the type of information it needs to render on the page. So again, if you're using a view model at some point, you would just change the model type here to your view model, and then you could show that on the page. We have a view bag, which is just an object that stores whatever you want, and title is just something that's randomly created. We could have named this ASDF. It wouldn't matter as long as we reference it using ASDF. And so basically this is going to make a page that renders our contact information. You see it maps directly to the model properties, and when you change them, it knows to set them directly that way. It also has some validation on there for some things out of the box, so you can make sure that certain things are happening, and you can change some of that validation as you need to. The index page is interesting because it basically allows us to create with a link, and then it has a table which shows the user ID, first name, last name, etc. for every model. And you see this is an IEnumerable, or any list of contact web contacts. And so here we've passed in db.contacts.toList as an IEnumerable, and it says, okay, I'll just create a for loop on each one of those and get the model item and get the item.userid and the item.firstname for each item in that model. We're going to display for that. And then we have the edit, details, and delete on the ID of that actual item. And that's essentially all we need for CRUD. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and run it. So we've done very little programming at this point. We have basically set up a database, configured it correctly. We created a user that we can log in as, and we have a contacts model that we migrated into the database. And we now have our controller for contacts, our contacts controller, which then has rendered out and scaffolded all of the views that we need. And we see already we have a table that has nothing in it. And we have our user logged in, so we can go ahead and create a new. But I don't know my user ID. Now, this is really bad because we don't want our users to know their user ID, and nobody's going to memorize a GUID. So just for this first demo, what I'm going to do is grab my user ID out of the database, and then I can put my contacts in place, and I can put whatever I want here for this information. And in fact, I could leave some of it blank. It really doesn't matter because I don't have any validation on here. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. You can see it does show my user ID and the information that I had entered, as well as the ability to list it and the ability to edit it. So let's go ahead and add in, their street address, which was like 234 West 4th or something. And they're in Chicago, Illinois, and I think it's actually 601 or something. I don't know. Anyway, there's our contact information saved. So at this point, we've already satisfied everything that they've asked us to do. We do have a required birthday field. So we have some information there, and we can actually just delete that because it's bad. So I just wanted to show that we can delete. So everything that we're required to do is already working, and we've literally done next to nothing as far as programming wise. But it's not working well. In fact, if I'm not logged in right now, and I said I want to go to contacts, if I typed it correctly, sorry about that, you can see that I'm not logged in and I see this person's contacts. In fact, I don't know a user's ID, but I could pretend to be that person and actually put in a contact under their user ID right now. So we don't have any kind of security in place to prevent people from seeing stuff. And I'm not logged in. I don't like you. I'm going to delete your contacts. So that's really bad. And or edit your contacts to, something nasty or whatever they would do to mess up your life. And so basically, we don't want them in there if they're not the right person. So we need to add some authorization as far as only people who are logged in can go to the contacts controller. And we need to use some lockdown information on the user to prevent people from hitting the contacts that don't belong to them or even seeing contacts that don't belong to them. Because the other thing you might know is if I'm smart and I see that edit takes in an ID, and I know that there's somebody out there who maybe has a contact, I could just start hitting numbers. And if that was a valid contact, that would be really bad for a person with contact 142 as I edit their information. So we want to prevent all of that from happening. So that's what we're going to work on next. And so what we want to do now is we want to go back into our system, go ahead and stop. We go back to the contacts controller, and let's just get this out so that we can work with it more easily. What we're going to do is we're going to add two simple methods to help us determine, number one, who are you? And number two, is your contact, or is this contact a member of your contacts that you can control? Now this will prevent people from editing the wrong contact or seeing the wrong contact, as well as help us to know behind the scenes who's actually logged in and allow us to keep the user from having to know their user ID. And so what I'm going to do is write one method called get current user ID. It's going to return a GUID, and we're going to use this a lot to determine who's the current user. So all we're going to do is leverage built-in structure of ASP.NET MVC to say return new GUID for the user .identity .get current logged in user, or get user ID. Now you see that says I don't know what that is. That's because we don't have identity actually referenced yet. So let's hover over this and hit Control dot, and then we'll say using ASP.NET identity, and suddenly everything works great. So that's nice. And then what we need to do is have one more method that we'll use privately, and we'll ensure is user contact, and we'll pass in a contact to this, and we'll just essentially run a quick command at that contact to make sure that the current user and that contact ID match. This is the incoming contact user ID. We need to make that equal to the get current user ID. So now we can make sure that any contact we want to modify, we ensure first that it's the right contact person, and we can also just determine who you are without you needing to know your GUID going forward. So we need to make some modifications to our actual controller actions in order to map that correctly. And so what I want to do is I want to go into the create method. And so right now, what we could do, we could pass the user ID to the UI and then return it back with the contact. And we may need to actually do that depending on how that binding ends up showing up. But what I'd like to do is see if we can't just go without that first of all. And then what we'll do is in the action here for creating, we'll make sure that you are who you say you are. So we'll get that first. We'll say the contact that's incoming dot user ID is going to be equal to get current user ID. And that should set the contact that's coming in to have your user ID. And so we should be okay there. And we'll do the same thing when we go to edit. On the contact that we're editing. And what you see here is if something were to go wrong, we do return back to the original view. So we need to make sure that if we do have to hydrate the model on the UI, we would do that here as well. But hopefully we'll be good to go without having to worry about that. And then what we want to do is we want to also make sure that the user contact is who they say they are. So when we go to edit, we want to actually look at the contact is not equal to null here, and or basically not ensure is user contact for the current contact. Basically that's the user ID that we're checking on that contact. So we need to make sure that that user ID that we're looking at is the right person. If not, it just returns a not found. And we do the same thing on delete. We don't want you deleting somebody's contact that's not yours. And of course, from the database, the contact already has our user ID on it, so we should be good to go. And that should take care of anybody doing things they shouldn't do against contacts that aren't theirs. We have one other thing we need to do. We have, at this point, not locked down the system to make it so that you have to be logged in. So to do that, we're just going to put an authorize attribute on top of all of the methods that we want to make sure you're logged in for. Now, I believe you could also just do it on the controller level and not have to go to the extreme of putting this authorize on every single one of these methods. But we're going to do it this way because I know for sure this will work. And this just prevents anybody from hitting these posts or gets without being logged in first. And so dispose doesn't matter, get current user ID doesn't matter, is user contact doesn't matter. So that authorizes the user before you can get into that method. So if I hit index and I'm not logged in, it will redirect me to the login page. And then once I'm authorized, it should bring me back to index. So that's the backend changes we needed to make in order to authorize and ensure the contact is correct. We have a couple changes we want to make on the front end. The UI still showing on the create and edit the user ID as well as on the index. So let's go ahead and just quickly make some changes to the CS.html or the Razor syntax here within this file. So we don't want to show the user ID. And again, if we were mapping from this to the model, we may need to add a hidden field. So we'll try to see if we can do it this way first. If we can't, what we'll do is we'll just hydrate it through the controller. And then we'll put a hidden field there to map it back. Because of the binding, we may see that issue. On the create, we don't want to expose the user ID. And I'm just hitting Control-KC to comment that out. And so that should take care of the create. On the delete, I don't believe we have any user ID information. We do, so we can go ahead and get rid of that as well. And on the details then, if we have user ID, let's get rid of it there too. And on the edit. And that should take care of showing the user ID. And we should have everything wired up. So let's see if we can actually still create and save contacts. And let's make sure we have to be logged in to do it. So I'm hitting F5 to run the application. And you can see since I ran it from contacts index, that's where it's trying to go. Since I'm not logged in, it says, oh, you better log in. And in fact, then it says, return URL will be contacts and index here. So if I put my email and my password in, and tell it to remember me so I don't have to do that next time, I'm going to log in. Now it lets me into my contacts and shows me the contacts for my user. Which reminds me that I forgot to do one other thing in my controller. I forgot to limit the return value of the contacts in my index. So let's go ahead and actually do that quickly. I'm going to need to stop, go back to my controller, and on my index, you see here I'm still getting all the contacts. What I need to do is change this link query, and I'm going to need to get my user ID separately because link won't let me run that function from within the call due to the functional nature of link. And so that's fine. So we'll just say our current user ID is equal to get current user ID. And then what I can do here is change toList, which I'll actually need, so I'll just leave that in place at the end. I'll say .where x maps to x.userid equals the user ID that I pulled from that method .toList. So now I'm only going to get the contacts that belong to me. And that just limits my details so that I can only see ones that are valid for my user. So let's go ahead and rerun this now. And again, I'm on the contacts controller now, so it should probably try to pull up contacts controller index. Or it might just bring me to the main page, which is fine. I'm still logged in. So again, if I weren't logged in and I hit my contact page, well, I don't have a link to it right now yet. So if I hit to contacts, I guess that's one way to keep it secure is not give a link to it, right? It does make me log in. Now that I'm logged in, I can create new. I see that these are, of course, my contacts because I had created them. If we had done other contacts for other users, we should not see them at this point. I'm just making sure I can still create new, and I have everything in place here without that user ID being passed through. And you can see that I can, and I can edit it. And just really quickly, we saw, in the edit, the user might be smart enough to say, I don't have anything, or maybe I don't have anything locking down. You can see we still get the 404 not found. So we're good to go. Even if we had a user that was in there that we didn't know about, and that would have been valid, we still would have got the 404. So it's hard to prove when we don't have other contacts that we could navigate to, but hopefully you understand the point of that. So with that, we have now basically made our system usable. It has everything in place. We have security in place. We need to add a nav, which I'm not going to do today because in the interest of time, we need to get this deployed. But at this point, we have everything that was being asked for, and we don't have the data tables, which again, if you watch the course, you would be able to access the data tables portion where we dress up the UI and allow for the searchable and pageable table that allows us to search for a specific contact and see that nice user-friendly interface. We're going to stop development on the actual web application at this point, and we're going to finish up these videos, or this video session, by creating the deployment to AppHarbor, as well as getting our stuff into our repository and Git. And so that's what we're going to do next, is create that Git repository and get it out to Bitbucket. All right, so we want to get Git set up. So let's go ahead and stop our application. So we could have done this prior to this point and made our repository have all of our changes tracked, but we've done so very little work at this point. We probably could recreate this very easily. So it's time now, though, before we start making any other changes, to not only get this into Git for our own sanity, but also for the ability to do the continuous integration and deployment out to AppHarbor. So you could have created a Git repository previous to this, and that's just fine if you did. If not, we need to create one on our project directory. Now, you can do it all through Visual Studio at this point. You can see you can create a new Git repository here. You can do things to that repository as you need to. For what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to use the command line to do my initialization, because I want to make sure that I have everything the way that I exactly want it to. So I'm going to go ahead and git bash at that folder for where my stuff is located. And if I did a quick ls, you can see that I have my folder for the contact live demo, as well as the solution in that folder, contact live demo, and the packages folder as well. So what I'm going to say is, first, in that folder, I want to have a git ignore, because I don't want to bring in files and things that I don't need. So what I'm going to do in my control here, and so one of the things about Windows is you can't just create dot files, but the git bash gives me the ability to do that very easily. And so if you don't have a .git ignore that you can easily just drag and drop into the contact web or whatever folder you're creating, the easiest way to create it is just to use the bash and say touch.git ignore. You can probably do this through PowerShell as well, if you're a PowerShell type of person. But there's my git ignore, and I want to open this, and there's nothing in it. So I could edit it through Vim if I wanted to, or any other code editor. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out to GitHub really quickly, and I'm going to search for a C# git ignore. And that should bring me to a really nice git ignore here, and I can just copy this code. Now you could download the entire repository and all that jazz, clone this, or just download the file, or whatever you need to do. I'm just going to copy paste today. Hopefully this will work fine. And I'm going to save that. So that's just basically going to eliminate a lot of the things that I don't want from being in my repository. And you should probably review that on your own, but that keeps out things like the SUO file, which you don't need. User stuff. It keeps out debugs, releases, x64, x86, bins, objects, and logs, which are huge cluttering and also could cause problems across users if you have to check in your bin every time you create a new DLL. It's really annoying. So just some really nice stuff that will be therefore eliminated. Just making sure that's saved. It did. So now that I have a valid git ignore, I'm going to go ahead and do a git init on this folder. And so that will set up my project here to have a .git folder. And now I'm tracking on master, which is exactly what I want. I'm going to say git add dot, which is going to bring every file that's not ignored into the staging. And if we actually look at this in Visual Studio at this point, let me just show that. We should be able to see here that we have changes in place. And it's actually not showing me that. It's still not registering that I'm in source control. Maybe I need to restart Visual Studio in order to see that at this point. And so I restarted Visual Studio, and you can see that it is there. So I do have that now. And if I look at my changes, I see all the stage changes which I just added. So I could double check that to make sure that these are the files I actually want to put into my Visual Studio, or excuse me, into my Git repository. And you can see that that's all there the way that I would want it. So I can either check it in through Visual Studio at this point, or I can use my git bash terminal, which is what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to just say git commit -m, and this is my initial commit. And you can see all of that was created, and hopefully this will update as we expected. And so now I have everything in place so that I can see my initial commit is in place on my Git repository. So the next thing I need to do is actually create the repository at Bitbucket. So I'm going to go out to Bitbucket, and I'm going to create my new repository. This is just going to be called Contact Web Live Demo. I'm going to keep it private, and I'm going to say Git. I'm going to leave the description as today's version, and I'm going to allow only private forks. I'm not going to add any project management tracking or issues. I'm going to set it to C#, And if I was using HipChat and wanted to have HipChat webhook notifications, great. I'll go ahead and create the repository. And so it says, okay, let's put some bits in. And then it says, what do you have? Switch to your repositories, connect your existing repository to Bitbucket, and push. So this is what I want to do in order to get my local repository. If I didn't have a local repository, I could clone this and then build my project in there. So had you started with with Git beforehand, you could have done it that way. But since we already have everything in place, we need these two commands. So let me just bring up Git bash again, and we'll just basically copy paste this by typing it. Git remote, add origin, and then it's going to be the link to your repo at Bitbucket, which mine is this one. And then Gorman, contact web live demo .git. So that set my upstream basically, and now I can say git push to the upstream, a new branch, or basically the first push here, origin, master. And so let's go ahead and do that. And it's pushing it out. And I've already done my stuff at Bitbucket many times, so I don't need to authenticate. If you did need to authenticate, of course, it would have asked you to do that at that point. So now I can look at my source, and hopefully everything will be in place. So let's just make it refresh, and there you see contact web live demo with the git ignore, the solution. Everything's in place. All of the stuff that we built, everything's ready to go. So we now have our solution checked into Git. We have it pushed out to contact web. We need to make a couple changes to make it work at AppHarbor, which we'll do in a minute. But first we need to get AppHarbor set up for this application and get the Git wired up. So what I want to do is create a new application. This is contact web live demo. And I need to make sure I'm logged in. Apparently I was not logged in. Okay, so now I have contact web live demo. And what I want to do is add on a SQL Server. And so with that, I'm going to look for SQL Server. And we're going to do the Yocto version, or whatever they call it, that's free, not dedicated. So let's find that. It's a shared SQL Server Yocto version that's free. You can, of course, spin up more if you need it. So let's bring this in. We're going to go ahead and install the free version onto our application. And this will give us user information and everything we need in order to log in to SQL Server. So that's available here. You go to SQL Server, and it brings up all the information you need in order to connect. So just to make sure that that works, I'm going to go ahead and try to connect to it directly via SQL Server Management Studio. And so to do that, I just need my information, and don't even try to steal this from me later, because I will probably delete it anyway, or at least change the password. So you can try, but it's okay. So there's my server, SQLizer.com. So that's what I'm going to put in here. And I changed this to SQL Server Authentication. And then I want to use my username that they gave me. Don't need that anymore. And I'm going to actually tell it to remember my password, even though I'll change it right after this. But that way I don't have to type this ridiculous password every time. You can reset it here anytime you want. Note that it also has a connection string right there. Let's go ahead and connect, make sure that we can. You see there's my database, and right now there's my database with nothing in it, which is exactly what we expected. So the last part of this first setup is I'm going to go ahead and connect Contact Web Live Demo back to, oops, so you see right now there's nothing there. That's fine. And it may look like that for a few minutes even after our first deploy, because it takes a while to propagate, but you see that everything is good to go. So I want to go back to my dashboard here, and I want to go to the builds. So let's find that. And you see right here it says configure Bitbucket, Codeplex, or GitHub to AppHarbor. So whichever one you're using, hopefully not Codeplex at this point. I don't think that's around anymore. Well, it may be in legacy, but Bitbucket is what we were using. So let's go ahead and do that. And the nice thing is that I've done this many times, so it knows to find my stuff. You may need to enter your your connection information to Bitbucket the first time. So I want to find contact web live demo. I'm going to wire that up and add that in. It's creating the bridge between Bitbucket and AppHarbor. Now what this will do is every time I check in to Bitbucket, it will automatically redeploy a version out to AppHarbor, which is pretty awesome. The last thing we need to do to make it all work is figure out a way to create our connection to the SQL Server once it's out there. And I'm going to show you that next. So we're going to go ahead and close this down, and we'll go back to our SQL Server, not our SQL Server. We're going to go back to Visual Studio. So let me pull that up here. And on the Solution Explorer here, what we're going to do is we're going to change the Web.config for release. So right now we don't have anything in here, and I like to clean all this out because I don't like all these comments being in here. It makes it just cluttered up in my mind. But you can keep them if you want to have those references. But basically what you see is when we release it, we're going to remove the attribute of debug, and we need to overwrite any of our server variables that we wanted to essentially overwrite. So if you were doing authentication at Facebook, you would need to do your app settings configurations for your app ID and your app secret. Again, that stuff's covered in more detail in the actual course, but we're not going to do that today. And the other important thing we need to do is, of course, replace our connection string. So we need a connection string here, and this is where we're going to map our connection string for AppHarbor. So we're going to add one, and the name needs to match exactly. So in fact, what you could do is just go to the Web.config and grab the connection string information from here. The difference is we're going to be doing users SQL Server authentication instead of integrated security. So I'm going to just make this easier to see by bringing some of this over into its own field. We'll keep the provider name as System Data SQL Client. One thing we're going to do is we're going to use the XDT transformations. So what we want is we want to add XDT transform, and that's going to be set attributes. And then we're going to do another XDT, and this is going to be a locator, and we're going to match by name. And that's going to allow us to match the default connection name from the original and overwrite it with what we put here. So I'm going to remove my connection string. I want to keep the multiple active result sets as true. And I want to just basically put in the important information about my connection. So what I'm going to do is go back out and grab off of my SQL Server here the connection string that they gave me. And I'm going to need to modify it just a little bit. So I believe I missed a letter there too. So I have my server is the server that they gave me. Then I have my database is the database, the user ID is the user ID, the password, that looks good. And multiple active result sets is true. So now when I connect to the database through the release, it should be connected to the AppHarbor database, not my own. So let's do a quick preview of the transform and make sure that looks good for that connection string. And so you see default connection is different, and it's replacing SQL Server information as we would expect. And then we should remove the debug, which it does. So that's exactly what we're expecting in our preview. So let's go ahead and save everything. And now we can just use Visual Studio. We have everything set up. The web release config is what we modified. So we can enter a message here, added AppHarbor info, and we can go ahead and commit that. We could actually right click and stage it if you want. That's just basically git add. You don't need to do that. If you hit stage and it's not staged, or if you hit add and it's not staged, it'll do it for you. But let's go ahead and do that. So now I can sync to push that information out to my Bitbucket repository right through Visual Studio. And that should make that change. So if we go look at Visual Studio, or excuse me, at Bitbucket, we should be able to see in our web release here the connection string information we were expecting, which we do. So that's good. And we should see at AppHarbor now that it's building. It's not deployed yet, so let's just give it a moment. And there we see that it's deployed. So it has deployed out to AppHarbor automatically after I checked in to Bitbucket. So that's pretty awesome. Let's see if it actually works. So again, this may take some time to propagate, so we may still see that in Nginx. But since it's been a few minutes since I created the application, it may be good to go at this point. The interesting thing is that the database was never wired up previous to this. So will the migrations work on first run? Let's find out. And this, of course, may be the reason it's taking so long. Maybe one of the reasons. And you see, here's my ASP.NET application. I don't have my link to the contacts. You could add that through nav. Let's see if we can register. Now, we haven't done anything else. And actually, if I already had this user, which would mean I was pointing back at my old database somehow, it wouldn't work, so that's good. Let's go ahead and register that. Passwords don't match because I can't type today. Make sure I typed that up here, actually. Okay, so now it's trying to register. So now it's probably trying to run migrations. So if we get an error with migrations, we could fix that by just running it from our local database pointing to theirs, or from our local machine pointing out to the AppHarbor database in our connection string on our default web config. You can just do update database, and that would wire everything up. But it looks like things are going to work here because we haven't seen an error yet. And it says, yeah, it looks like it's going to work. At contactweblivedemo.appharbor.com, I have this. And if I just know that it's going to be contacts, I can go ahead and start creating some information. And we'll just put a birthday in here just really quickly. There's my contact. I can, of course, edit it. Save that. Details. Everything looks good. I can delete it just like I would expect. Let's just create one just so we have something to delete and leave one in there. Delete that. Yep. Okay. So that's good. It's out at AppHarbor. Everything's wired up. We're looking great. Our transformation apparently worked like we would have expected it to without us having to do a lot of work. And we have everything in place. And in fact, what we can do to verify that is look at our database here that's out at AppHarbor. And there we see our contacts. And if we select from that contact, we see there we are with a different user ID and different contact information. And that, my friends, is all there is to doing this. Now, again, this is the tip of the iceberg. We've touched on a few of the concepts with the MVC architecture as far as the models, views, and controllers. We were able to wire everything up to a live Git repository that's at Bitbucket, which then had continuous integration and deployment out to AppHarbor. And so as soon as we do a check-in, it gets the latest version and deploys that out. So that's really awesome. And we have a database that's storing information, and we have done all of this for free. So we could easily now put this link into our LinkedIn profile or on our resume, and even send in our cover letter as a sample of some of the things that we're able to do to show that we're capable of being programmers. Again, this isn't all you would need to be a very good ASP.NET MVC programmer, but this is the start for where you needed to come from. And this gives us that nice overview of what ASP.NET MVC will do for us behind the scenes. There will be some more advanced things that need to be done in a real production environment, and those aren't going to be covered on this video or in this course. So just keep that in mind. But essentially, this gets you going and lives up to its name of being the ASP.NET MVC Quick Start, where you've now got a basically start to finish product with CRUD operations deployed out to a public-facing website that you can give to anyone to show your work. You would want to, of course, change the nav to add the contacts link here so it would be easy to find. And you could also, of course, change the themes and do any other stuff you'd want to do. And you'll likely, if you want to really dress this up, want to bring in something like data tables, if not data tables, to do a nicer grid that's searchable and sortable. But that's going to conclude our video today in this demonstration of getting from the ground up an entire application deployed with CRUD operations to a public-facing web URL, which gives you something to put into your LinkedIn profile or resume for your next job application to help you stand out above all the other candidates. Thanks so much for sticking with me, and I hope to see you soon.